Death Claims, a Dave Brandstetter mystery. Book 2. Author, Joseph Hansen. Publisher, University of Wisconsin Press, Terrace Books. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 13. The Medallion Building on Wilshire was a sleek tower of glass and steel. On its 10th floor, Dave used a slab door that had his name on it, trapped behind plexiglass. The office he stepped into was wide. Its far wall was glass. A woven hanging covered another wall. Rough, undyed wool yarns, earth colors, Norwegian. The chairs were slices of hide racked on frames of brushed steel. 2 of them were goatskin, the fur on white fur. Those were for visitors. Not that there were many visitors. He wasn't here that much. The chair back of the desk was saddle leather. The desk itself was oiled, teak slabs and another brushed steel framework. He liked it to be clear. He even kept the phone in a drawer. Now a stack of papers lay on it. Frowning, he let the door whisper shut behind him, crossed deep tobacco-colored carpet to the desk. He sat down, put on the reading glasses, shuffled the papers. No problems. Routine. They only needed his initials. He slid open a silent drawer, took out a pen, sheathed in rosewood, slender, but heavy, twisted out the ballpoint, signed this set, the next, old men dying, old women dying, a child dying, 7 deaths since he'd been here last, day before yesterday, and in that time, how many deaths had there been that didn't need his initials, that with all the initials in the world would pay no one in any terms but grief? He thought of Biafra. He thought of Southeast Asia. He thought of Ingalls, moving gray and dutiful through that fine old house, to and from a rented hospital bed that held his maimed and fading wife, fetching this, taking that away, days, nights, months, years. Who could number the errands of mercy, the errands of despairing love? To what end? A red truck rattling off with the empty remnants of a life. He put the pen back, shut the shallow drawer, opened a deep drawer, took out the telephone from his wallet. He slipped a business card he'd picked up beside a Rococo cash register yesterday. He punched a button on the phone and dialed the number on the card. A long number as the ring signal repeated itself in its ear. The door opened. His father stood there, handsome, erect, white-haired. Dave threw him a quick smile, lifted his chin. Carl Brandstetter came in and moved to a wood-grained metal cabinet where bronze chrysanthemums stood in a flame-colored jar. He took from the cabinet a frosted pitcher, frosted glasses, ice cubes. He shut the top drawer, opened a lower one for gin, vermouth, olives. His white brows queried Dave. Dave nodded. "Oates and Norwood," the phone said in his ear. "David Brandstetter, Mrs. Oates," he said. "You were right. John Oates was an addict. I'm in your debt for telling me. He was getting morphine from a hospital. Orderly. What I need to know now is where the cash came from to pay for it. Prices run high." "Well, it certainly didn't come from me. He left me penniless. I always knew he would. Never get mixed up with a charmer, Mr. Brandstetter. It anesthetizes the instinct for self-preservation. Last night you thought he'd left you $20,000 in life insurance." "You're wrong," she said. "I knew he'd written me off and written Peter in. I saw the papers from your company in his room at the hospital. But I never told Charles. I couldn't force myself. That was what upset me last night. The effect the news would have on Charles. The effect it did have. He aged 10 years in that hour. All the hope went out of him." "I'm sorry," Dave said. "Let me understand this. He thought you'd get the money and invest it in the shop." "He knows the shop is all I have. 25 years of my life are in this shop. There'd have been nothing else for me to do." "Could he have been giving John Oates money?" Her laugh was harsh and humorless. "Oh, yes, indeed. If he'd had anything left after what he'd paid John for his share in the business. But it so happens that Charles was the same sort of victim I was. Peter was. Even April Stannard was. Though I'm not about to waste sympathy on her. Charles had given all there was to give right at the start. John Oates asked Twilight Ingalls for money. Who told you? She asked it sharply. Ingalls. He's got problems of his own, or had at the time, but he gave what he could spare. I found out about him through a telephone bill. Another long-distance number was on that bill. I wonder if you can tell me whose it is. He gave it to her. Sam Wald. She sounded thoughtful. A writer. Not of books, films, television. Thank you, Dave said. Any word from Peter? If word comes from Peter, it won't come to me. That's what they all say. All right, Mrs. Oates. Later. He hung up, got out of the chair, took one of the two icy little glasses off the cabinet as he passed, sipped from it as he went to the door, opened the door. Miss Taney, find me the address in Hollywood of Sam Wald. If it's not in the book, try the Screenwriters Guild. Lay on all the credentials. If they still won't give you the address, tell them you've got a big dividend check for him. That will tug at their heartstrings. It always does. Do it now, please. He let the door close. I'd hoped you'd have lunch with me. His father sat easy in one of the goatskin chairs, martini on the floor at his handsomely shod feet. From a flat red and white box, he took a brown cigarette. He slid the box away and used a gold butane lighter to start the smoke. I'd like you to meet a very lovely young lady. I'll bet she is, Dave said. They always are, but I have to see a man about a murder. To serve the ends of logic, Carl Brandstetter picked up his drink. It has to have been this son. I've never known you to get sidetracked. The tracks in this case meander, and there are a lot of them. Dave went back to the desk to put the phone away. But my hunch is that if I follow them far enough, they'll all end up at a place called Arana Blanca, on a rainy night when a man went into the ocean and didn't come back anymore. He sat on a corner of the desk and lit a cigarette. Nanette won't spot you at lunch with Love's young dream. His father smiled. Nanette is in residence in Reno. The smile became a wince. All expenses paid. Why not be smart? Dave said. Save money. Don't marry this one. He took another swallow of his drink, trying to top up exactly how many stepmothers there'd been in the 45 years since he'd howled his first protest at life. They shifted in and out of focus. A face, a voice, a name, a scent of soap, the taste of certain supper, a warm Coke at a dusty country filling station, laughter, a slap. His own mother was less than these. Not even a snapshot, merely a name on a marriage license dated 1922. Turning brown at the edges. He'd found it at age 9 when he'd dropped a heavy carton of stuff from his father's desk during a move, and it had blown with other papers across the lawn. He'd worn it inside his shirt for weeks and cried over it when he was alone, imagining he missed her. He'd been sulky and savage to his father and to the bewildered girl who was his last lost mother's third replacement. A breasty, wide-eyed blonde child who lived in a pink kimono, stitched with pale green dragon in a haze of Turkish cigarette smoke. 1932. He'd grown tired of mourning someone he'd never known and put the paper away. He still had it somewhere. He didn't know why. What was his father saying now? That this girl was different? I'm aware I've made mistakes. 9 of them, to be brutally exact, but even I can learn, given a few decades and sufficient humiliation. I hope you're right. Dave gave him a level smile. You know how much I hope that. His father rose. You could come meet her. You'd see. She's very wonderful. You'd like her. That would make her different, Dave said. His father set his glass on the cabinet. Some of the chrysanthemums straggled. He frowned and worked at straightening them. You like Lisa. He said it without emphasis. Dave stared at him. Lisa's name hadn't come up between them in more than 20 years. Yes, he'd liked her. Too much, as it turned out. His father had resented the way young Dave ignored Barbara, Susan, Ruth, but when the boy had taken to Lisa, she was 19. Dave only 2 years younger. He'd resented that no less. For once, he'd chosen a girl with more than looks, with brains and background. Her father had been a high court judge in Germany, till the Nazis shot him. Dave couldn't recall now what had happened to Lisa's mother. Her 2 brothers had tried to leave Germany and failed. Only she had escaped. There was mournfulness to her dark beauty, but her smile was radiant. So was her mind. And she'd been someone in his own house at last to whom he could talk about books and music, painting and theater, things that made a difference to him. Thinking back on it now, maybe there'd been some justice to his father's jealousy. Maybe Dave had been half in love with her. He still remembered with good warmth their jaunts to the old museum and exposition park, to the sleepy white rooms of the Huntington Library, to organ recitals in the gray towering hollowness of a cold downtown church, to chamber music concerts in a bare wooden hall in a west side park where a beaky, balding Igor Stravinsky had sometimes twitched a baton, all of which Carl Brandstetter had made it plain bored him, so that the two youngsters had taken to going alone, and to political meetings that wouldn't have bored his father, but would have angered him. Then there had been a little cafe not far from his school, where he and Lisa had sometimes met for lunch. Strong farmhouse coffee, the good smell of newly baked bread, rain on a steamy window pane. Had they met that way often? Too often, he guessed. Yet, of course, he'd been no threat to his father, even if Lisa had been capable of unfaithfulness, and she wasn't. He had no use for girls sexually, but his father didn't know that. If Dave had worked up the nerve to tell him, would the marriage to Lisa have lasted? Possibly. He hadn't found the nerve, though. Not till after the war, when Lisa was gone and forgotten with the rest. He said now, "Is she like Lisa?" His father's smile was thin. "As like Lisa as your Mr. Sawyer is like Rod." "Externals?" Dave shrugged and finished his drink. "Dangerously deceptive." He got off the desk corner. His father paused with his glass lifted, frowning, pretending concern. "Something wrong there?" "Some confusion about who's dead and who's alive. But if it can be straightened out, I'll straighten it." "You could let it go," his father said. "That's your style." Dave peered into the martini pitcher. "Not mine." He tilted the pitcher over his father's glass. Over his own, it measured out exactly. "He working yet?" Carl Brandstetter asked. "The offers have all been for overseas post. Too secret to discuss, but at least until this morning he didn't want to go overseas again." His father started to ask something and stopped because Miss Taney opened the door. For 60 years, Miss Taney had maintained inside a body like an assemblage of bleached sticks the spirit of a nerve-shattered girl of 5. Her mouth never stopped trembling. Her eyes were wide with fright. She delivered all messages in a kind of whispered shriek. The more so now in the awesome presence of Carl Brandstetter, managing director and chairman of the board. "Excuse me, Mr. Sam Wald is no longer a member of the Screenwriters Guild, but they gave me his address just as you said they would." She held a memo in a blue-veined hand that shook. "Thank you," Dave said. "You can take these forms." She took them and fled. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.